Discipline does not begin with a plan. It does not begin with motivation. It does not even begin with desire. Discipline begins in one specific place, and most people never look there. Discipline begins where excuses end. Think about that carefully, because it is not just a clever phrase. It is the exact boundary line between the life you have and the life you say you want. Here is what most people misunderstand. They believe discipline is something you either have or don't have, some fixed trait handed to certain people and withheld from others. But discipline is not a trait. It is a decision, repeated daily, and it only becomes visible the moment you stop negotiating with yourself. Until that negotiation ends, discipline cannot exist, no matter how much you want it to. Think about your own excuses for a moment, honestly, without softening them. I'm too tired today. I'll start Monday. I don't have enough time right now. I work better under pressure anyway. Notice something about all of these statements. They all sound reasonable. They all sound almost responsible. That is exactly what makes excuses so dangerous. They rarely feel like excuses in the moment. They feel like valid explanations, protected by logic, difficult to argue against, especially when you're the one saying them to yourself. Now, understand something important. An excuse and a reason are not the same thing, even though they often wear the same clothing. A reason explains why something happened. An excuse justifies why something didn't happen and quietly gives you permission to let it continue not happening. The difference is subtle, but it is everything, because reasons close a chapter while excuses keep the same chapter open indefinitely, repeating itself week after week, disguised as new circumstances each time. Let that sink in. Every excuse you've ever used has felt slightly different, slightly justified by that day's specific situation. But strip away the surface details, and you'll find the same pattern underneath, repeating itself in different disguises. The excuse changes its clothing. Its function never does. Now let's talk about why excuses feel so necessary in the moment they're made. Excuses exist to protect something, usually comfort, sometimes identity, occasionally fear of failure disguised as caution. When you make an excuse, you are not lying to manipulate someone else. You are protecting yourself from an uncomfortable truth, that you had the ability to act and chose not to. An excuse softens that truth. It turns should have into couldn't have, turns choice into circumstance, turns responsibility into something that happened to you rather than something you allowed. Think about how much relief an excuse provides in the short term. It removes the discomfort of admitting you simply didn't want to do the hard thing today. But that relief is temporary, and it comes at a devastating long-term cost, because every excuse accepted quietly teaches your mind a dangerous lesson, that discomfort is optional, that commitment is negotiable, that your word to yourself can be broken whenever inconvenience shows up. Now, consider what happens when this pattern repeats over months and years. It doesn't just cost you the specific action you avoided. It costs you trust in yourself, a trust that becomes harder and harder to rebuild the longer the pattern continues. Eventually, you stop believing your own commitments before you even make them, because some part of you already expects the excuse to arrive and win the same way it always has. Let's talk about where discipline actually starts, because it is not where most people think. Discipline does not start with a perfect morning routine or an elaborate system or a burst of motivation. Discipline starts the moment an excuse arrives and you refuse to accept it. That single refusal, repeated consistently, is the entire foundation. Everything else, the habits, the results, the transformation, is simply what accumulates once that foundation exists. Think about the exact moment an excuse shows up in your mind. It usually arrives quickly, almost automatically, right before the action you were planning to take. I'll skip today. I'll make it up tomorrow. This one time won't matter. That moment right there is the entire battlefield. Not later, not in some abstract future decision. Right there in that split second, discipline either begins or excuses win again. Now let's talk about why this split-second moment matters so much more than people realize. Most people believe willpower is something you either have plenty of or you don't, a resource you either possess in abundance or lack entirely. But willpower is not really the deciding factor here. What actually decides the outcome is whether you've trained yourself to recognize the excuse the instant it appears, before it has time to dress itself up in convincing language and take control of the decision. Think about how quickly an excuse can escalate if left unchallenged. It starts as a small thought, maybe just this once, and within seconds, your mind has already built an entire justification around it, complete with reasonable sounding evidence for why today is different, why the rules don't quite apply the same way today. This entire process happens fast, often before you've even consciously noticed it's happening. That's why discipline isn't really about fighting excuses after they've fully formed. It's about catching them the moment they arrive, before they've had time to build their case. Now, understand something crucial about this recognition skill. It is trainable. The same way any skill is trainable through repetition and awareness. The first few times you catch an excuse forming and refuse it anyway, it feels difficult, almost unnatural. But each time you do it, the recognition becomes faster, the refusal becomes easier, until eventually catching an excuse before it takes hold becomes as automatic as the excuse itself once was. Let's talk about the specific language excuses use, because learning to recognize this language is one of the most practical tools available. Excuses almost always use qualifying words designed to create wiggle room. Just this once. I'll make up for it later. It's not that big a deal. These phrases exist for one purpose, to make the exception feel small, isolated, harmless. But no excuse exists in isolation. Every excuse sets a precedent for the next one, quietly lowering the bar for what counts as acceptable the next time resistance shows up. Think about the compounding effect of small exceptions. One skipped commitment rarely destroys anything on its own, but it teaches your mind that the commitment is flexible, negotiable, dependent on mood rather than decision. And once that lesson is learned, it gets applied again and again until what started as an isolated exception has become the actual pattern, while the original commitment has quietly become the exception instead. Now let's talk about a distinction that changes everything once you understand it. The difference between comfort and rest. Rest is a decision made deliberately in service of recovery and sustainability. Comfort, in the context of excuses, is avoidance disguised as self-care. The difference is not always obvious on the surface, because both can look identical from the outside. But internally, they feel completely different. Rest leaves you feeling restored, ready to return to the work. Comfort, when it's actually avoidance, leaves you feeling slightly uneasy, aware somewhere underneath that you chose ease over commitment. Think about how often people justify skipping something important by calling it rest, when honestly, underneath the justification, they know it was avoidance. This distinction matters because discipline is not about eliminating rest. Rest is necessary, even essential. Discipline is about eliminating the dishonest version of rest, the kind that exists purely to protect comfort while pretending to protect well-being. Now let's talk about identity again, because excuses and identity are deeply connected. Every time you accept an excuse, you are casting a small vote for a particular identity. Someone who breaks commitments when it's inconvenient. Someone whose word depends on circumstances. And every time you refuse an excuse, you cast a vote for the opposite identity. Someone whose commitments hold regardless of mood, regardless of convenience, regardless of how compelling the excuse sounds in the moment. Think about which identity your recent decisions have been voting for. This is not meant to create shame. It is meant to create clarity, because most people have never actually looked at their pattern of excuses as a voting record for who they're becoming. Once you see it that way, every small decision takes on new weight, not because the individual action matters enormously on its own, but because of what it's building, vote by vote, and by decision over time. Now consider what it means to interrupt a long pattern of accepted excuses. It rarely feels dramatic the first time you do it. You simply notice the excuse forming, recognize it for what it is, and choose the harder option anyway, quietly, without any audience or applause. That single, unremarkable moment is where discipline actually begins. Not in some future version of yourself who has already become disciplined, but right there, in the ordinary moment where an excuse was offered and refused. Now let's talk about the excuses that don't feel like excuses at all. The ones disguised as wisdom, as strategy, as patience. These are the most dangerous kind because they don't trigger the usual internal alarm. Nobody feels guilty saying, "I'm just being strategic about timing," or "I'm waiting for the right conditions." These phrases sound mature, thoughtful, even responsible. But strip away the sophisticated language, and often what remains underneath is the same avoidance that a simpler excuse would have revealed instantly. Think about how easy it is to dress up delay in intelligent-sounding reasoning. I need more information before I start. I'm optimizing my approach first. I don't want to rush into this without a proper plan. Each of these can be legitimate occasionally. But far more often, they are excuses wearing a disguise sophisticated enough to fool the very person using them. The test is simple, even if uncomfortable to apply honestly. Ask yourself, if I strip away the intelligent language, am I actually preparing or am I simply avoiding the discomfort of beginning? Now understand something important about this kind of disguised excuse. It is harder to defeat than an obvious one, precisely because it doesn't feel like weakness. It feels like wisdom. And because it feels like wisdom, it can persist for months, even years, without ever being challenged, because you never identify it as the actual obstacle. You believe you're being careful, when in reality, you're simply delaying the moment discipline would otherwise require you to begin. Let's talk about a related trap, the excuse of waiting for feeling ready. This might be the most universal excuse of all, because it feels so reasonable on the surface. Of course, you should feel ready before beginning something important. Except readiness, as covered before, is manufactured through action, not granted in advance. Waiting to feel ready is functionally identical to waiting forever, because the feeling you're waiting for typically doesn't arrive until after you've already started and built some evidence of your own capability. Think about how this excuse specifically targets people who are actually capable, often more capable than they realize. It doesn't stop lazy people, because lazy people were never going to try regardless. It stops capable, thoughtful people, the ones who take commitment seriously enough that they want to feel prepared before making it. That seriousness, ironically, becomes the exact vulnerability the excuse exploits. Now let's talk about the physical sensation of resisting an excuse, because understanding this in advance removes much of its power. When you refuse an excuse and choose the harder option instead, it rarely feels good in the moment. It often feels uncomfortable, sometimes even worse than giving in would have felt. This is normal. This is expected. Discipline was never going to feel pleasant in real time, only worthwhile in retrospect. The mistake most people make is expecting the discipline choice to feel rewarding immediately. And when it doesn't, they interpret that discomfort as a sign they made the wrong choice. Think about training your expectations here specifically. If you expect discomfort the moment you refuse an excuse, that discomfort no longer surprises you or convinces you to reverse course. You simply move through it the same way you'd move through any expected difficulty, because you already knew it was coming and decided in advance it wasn't going to change your decision. Now let's talk about the specific relationship between excuses and small commitments, because this is where most people lose the larger battle without realizing it. People often reserve their discipline for big, important decisions, while allowing themselves unlimited exceptions on small ones. They'll commit fiercely to a major goal while excusing themselves constantly on the small daily actions that goal actually depends on. But discipline doesn't discriminate by size. A small excuse accepted repeatedly does exactly as much damage as a large one, because the pattern being reinforced is identical regardless of the stakes involved. Think about how this plays out practically. Someone commits seriously to building a business, a body, a skill, but excuses themselves from the small daily actions. The extra hour of focused work, the workout on a tired day, the practice session when motivation is low. They believe the big commitment matters more than these small moments, when in reality, big commitment is entirely built from these small moments. And excusing the small ones quietly dismantles the large one from the inside. Now, consider what it means to treat small commitments with the same seriousness as large ones. This doesn't mean becoming rigid or extreme. It means recognizing that every small excuse accepted is training your mind toward a pattern that will eventually show up in the moments that matter most, because the mind doesn't distinguish between small and large exceptions. It only recognizes the pattern of exception itself, and that pattern, once established, applies indiscriminately. Now let's talk about what happens after you refuse an excuse, because the moment of refusal is not the finish line. It is only the beginning of the actual work. Many people treat the decision itself as the hard part, and once they've made it, they expect the rest to unfold easily. But discipline requires more than one refusal. It requires the willingness to refuse the same excuse again tomorrow, and the day after that, indefinitely, because excuses do not surrender after losing once. They return, often in a slightly different form, testing whether yesterday's refusal was a genuine decision or simply a temporary mood. Think about how discouraging this can feel if you don't expect it. You refuse an excuse today, feel a sense of accomplishment, and then wake up tomorrow facing the exact same internal negotiation again, as if nothing had been settled at all. This is not failure. This is simply how discipline actually works. It is not a single victory that permanently ends the war. It is a daily choice, repeated so many times that eventually the excuse stops showing up with the same intensity. Not because you defeated it once, but because you've defeated it consistently enough that it has less evidence to work with. Now understand something important about this repetition. Each time you refuse the same excuse, it costs slightly less energy than the time before. The first refusal is often the hardest because you're fighting against years of accepted patterns. But each subsequent refusal chips away at that pattern until eventually the excuse arrives with noticeably less force, sometimes barely registering at all. This is the payoff of consistency that most people quit right before reaching, because the early repetitions feel disproportionately difficult compared to the ease that eventually follows. Let's talk about what it looks like when discipline becomes less effortful, because this transition often confuses people. They expect discipline to always require the same intense willpower it demanded in the beginning. But if you've been consistently refusing an excuse for long enough, the internal negotiation eventually quiets. Not because you've become a fundamentally different person overnight, but because the specific behavior has moved from requiring conscious willpower to becoming a more automatic pattern, similar to how a difficult new skill eventually becomes second nature through enough repetition. Think about brushing your teeth, something almost nobody negotiates with anymore, despite the fact that as a child, this likely required real enforcement and resistance. The behavior didn't become easier because the action itself changed. It became easier because repetition moved it from the category of decision into the category of automatic habit. The exact same transformation is available for far more significant behaviors, but it requires surviving the uncomfortable period where the behavior still requires active willpower before it eventually shifts into something closer to automatic. Now let's talk about setbacks, because even with all of this understanding, there will be days you give in to an excuse anyway. This is not a sign that everything previously built has been destroyed. One accepted excuse does not erase the pattern you've been building, The same way one refused excuse doesn't build the entire pattern on its own. What matters is not perfection. What matters is the overall trend, the ratio of refused excuses to accepted ones, tracked honestly over time. Think about how much damage people do to their own progress by treating a single setback as proof the entire effort has failed. This thinking pattern, often called all or nothing thinking, causes more abandoned commitments than the original excuse ever could have on its own. One skip day becomes an excuse to skip the entire week, which becomes an excuse to abandon the goal entirely, all triggered by treating a single, imperfect moment as a complete failure rather than simply one data point in a much longer pattern. Now understand the healthier response to a setback. Notice it honestly, without excessive self-criticism, and simply return to the pattern the next opportunity you have. Discipline is not about never breaking, because everyone breaks occasionally. Discipline is about how quickly you return after breaking, how little time you allow the excuse to convince you that the entire effort was pointless. The gap between one missed day and returning to the pattern is often the most important gap in the entire process, more important in many ways than the original decision itself. Think about the people who ultimately succeed at building lasting discipline. Almost none of them did it with perfect consistency from the very first day. What separated them was not the absence of setbacks, but the speed and consistency of their return after each one. That returning, more than any single decision, is where real discipline gets built. Now let's talk about the environment surrounding your excuses, because discipline does not exist in a vacuum. It exists inside a context shaped by the people around you, the spaces you occupy, and the habits woven into your daily routine. Many people fight an exhausting internal battle against excuses, while ignoring the external conditions that keep generating those excuses in the first place. You can win the internal argument 100 times, but if your environment constantly presents the path of least resistance, you will eventually lose more often than you win, simply through sheer repeated exposure. Think about how much easier discipline becomes when the environment supports it rather than works against it. If distraction is one tap away at all times, resisting it requires constant willpower. But if distraction requires deliberate effort to access, the excuse loses much of its convenience. And convenience is often the single biggest factor in whether an excuse succeeds. Excuses thrive on ease. They struggle to survive friction. Now understand something important about designing your environment deliberately. This is not about achieving some perfect, distraction-free existence, which realistically does not exist for most people. It is about reducing the number of moments where willpower alone has to carry the entire weight of the decision. Every obstacle you place between yourself and the easy excuse is one less battle your discipline has to fight completely unaided. Think about the people around you as well, because their standards often become an invisible ceiling or floor for your own. If everyone around you normalizes excuses, treats inconsistency as acceptable, celebrates comfort over effort, that normalization seeps into your own internal standard without you fully realizing it happened. Discipline is contagious in both directions. Spend enough time around people who refuse excuses consistently, and their standard begins to feel achievable, even normal, for you as well. Now let's talk about a subtle excuse that deserves specific attention. The excuse of exceptionalism, the belief that your particular circumstances are uniquely difficult, uniquely different from everyone else who has successfully built discipline before you. This excuse is powerful because it often contains some truth. Your circumstances probably are different in some ways, but the trap lies in extending that partial truth into a complete justification for exemption, as though difficult circumstances have ever been a legitimate reason for permanent inaction rather than simply a reason for a different starting point. Though, think about how many people who eventually built extraordinary discipline started from circumstances that were genuinely difficult, genuinely unfair in specific ways. Their circumstances didn't disqualify them from building discipline. They simply meant their path required more resilience along the way. The existence of difficulty was never evidence that discipline was impossible. It was only evidence that the path would require more from them than it might require from someone starting with more advantages. Now let's talk about how excuses interact with comparison, because comparing your capacity to someone else's is one of the fastest ways to manufacture a convincing excuse. They have more time than me. They have fewer responsibilities than me. Their situation is easier than mine. Some of this may even be factually true in specific instances. But comparison, even accurate comparison, changes nothing about your own capacity to act within your own actual circumstances. It only provides a compelling reason to feel justified in not acting, which is precisely what makes it such an effective excuse. Think about redirecting that comparative energy toward a more useful question. Instead of asking whether your circumstances are as favorable as someone else's, ask what is actually possible for you, specifically, given exactly what you currently have. That question, unlike comparison, actually produces movement because it focuses entirely on what remains within your control rather than what remains outside of it. Now let's talk about the language you use internally when discussing your own discipline, because language shapes belief more than most people realize. If you consistently describe yourself as someone who struggles with discipline, someone who has always had trouble following through, that internal narrative becomes a kind of self-fulfilling prediction, offering a built-in excuse before any specific situation even arises. Changing this internal narrative, even before the behavior has fully caught up, begins shifting the pattern of excuses you're likely to accept going forward. State 5. Script generation, part 6 of 6, final. Now let's bring everything together, because all of this understanding means nothing unless it changes what happens the next time an excuse shows up in your mind. You now know how excuses disguise themselves as reasons, how they escalate quickly if left unchallenged, how they hide inside sophisticated language about strategy and readiness, how they exploit convenience in your environment, and how comparison quietly manufactures justification for staying exactly where you are. None of that knowledge matters if the next excuse still wins, simply because old habits are stronger than new understanding. Think about the specific excuse that has been running your life the longest, the one so familiar it barely registers as an excuse anymore. Maybe it's the story that you work better under pressure, so there's no need to start early. Maybe it's the belief that you're simply not a morning person, so early discipline isn't realistic for you. Maybe it's the quiet assumption that motivation has to arrive before action can begin. Whatever it is, it has likely been operating in the background for years, disguised as fact, rather than recognized as the excuse it actually is. Now, understand something clearly. That excuse will show up again, probably soon, possibly today. And when it does, the entire outcome depends on one thing: whether you recognize it the instant it arrives, before it has time to build its familiar, convincing case. This is the exact location where discipline begins, not in some future version of your life where everything feels easier, but in that specific moment, repeated daily, where an excuse arrives and you choose differently than you have before. Think about what it would mean to treat today differently, not because today is special, but because you've decided it will be the day you start noticing the excuse the moment it forms, rather than accepting it automatically the way you have for years. This does not require a dramatic transformation. It requires one small refusal, followed by another tomorrow, followed by another the day after, until the pattern that has controlled your decisions for so long finally begins to weaken through consistent resistance, rather than one impossible moment of perfect willpower. Now consider the cost of continuing to let this particular excuse win. Not dramatically, not through some singular catastrophic failure, but through the same slow, quiet erosion that excuses have always specialized in. Another month passing, Another version of the same conversation with yourself. Another year where the gap between who you are and who you want to become stays exactly the same width it was 12 months ago. That cost is real, even though it never announces itself loudly enough to feel urgent in any single moment. Think about the alternative path, the one available to you, starting with the very next excuse that arrives. Recognize it. Name it honestly, without the sophisticated language it usually wears. And refuse it, not perfectly, not permanently, in one single decision, but specifically in that one moment, choosing the harder option instead of the easier one. That single refusal will not transform your entire life instantly, but it will do something equally important. It will prove to yourself that the pattern can be interrupted, that the excuse is not as powerful as years of repetition have made it feel. Now understand the deeper truth underneath everything covered here. Discipline was never about becoming a fundamentally different type of person, someone naturally gifted with willpower that you don't currently possess. Discipline is built the same way for everyone, through the accumulation of moments where an excuse was offered and refused, repeated so many times that the refusal eventually becomes easier than the excuse itself ever was. There is no shortcut around this process, no motivational trick that replaces the actual repetition required. Think about where you are right now, in this exact moment, holding everything you've just heard. The excuse that has controlled your decisions for years is likely already forming somewhere in the background, ready to activate the next time discomfort shows up. You now know what that excuse looks like, how it will try to disguise itself, and exactly where the real battle takes place. The only question remaining is whether you will recognize it this time or let it operate the same way it always has, unnoticed and unchallenged. Discipline begins where excuses end. Not someday, not once conditions improve, not after you feel more prepared. It begins the next time an excuse arrives, in whatever ordinary moment that happens to be, and you choose deliberately to refuse it. That refusal, repeated daily, is the entire foundation everything else is built upon. Start there. Start now, and let discipline begin exactly where your excuses finally end